Hey everybody, for this week's Off the Rails episode, I'm going to present another chapter in full from my Shooting 101 Photography Fundamentals course. This chapter is all about the importance of triangles and geometric shapes in your composition, something pretty interesting and not something you would necessarily think about. If you want to learn more about the course and see more course samples, go to 52frames.com/course. And in the meantime, enjoy. All right, guys, our last chapter in our composition fundamentals section and our last least important composition fundamentals, which I did say I was organizing from most, how do I put this? Least important to the most least. Triangles, the golden triangle, geometric shapes in general, I think it's quite fascinating, and I think it's really fun and enlightening to analyze very good works, professional photographers, interesting photographs that just catch your eye, and find these geometric shapes, particularly triangles in these compositions. With all that said, though, I personally wouldn't rate this as a priority. It's not necessarily very high up in the things that you need to know in order to take a good photograph, which is why I've saved this for last. I don't mean to dilute what I'm about to teach. It is very cool. It is very inspiring, and it is important. I just feel it's important to give over as well. You don't have to bombard, or you don't have to feel responsible as a new student to photography to take on everything, right? And to feel bad, let's say, for not knowing everything, or even worse, being fearful that you can't possibly keep all of this in mind. So that's why I give a little prioritization. Less important. You don't have to take all of this in at once. But with that said, it is very cool. And it is, I believe, part of composition fundamentals. So what is the golden triangle? We just finished talking about the craziness of the golden spiral. A lot of golden things in photography. So how do we make the golden triangle overlay here? We basically cut the image diagonally from corner to corner, and then from the other two corners, we create a line that intersects that diagonal line at a 90-degree angle. This creates some nice triangles in our image, and if you use this overlay on paintings, famous photographs, you will identify these patterns and these triangular compositions being utilized, which I think is pretty cool. But like the golden spiral, I personally wouldn't know how to apply this intuitively when you have the camera to your eye, you're out and you're shooting. Perhaps if you were in a studio setting and you were able to even put these overlays on your screen as you're framing, well, that actually could be a really useful tool. But what I'm going to talk more about in this chapter are specifically triangles in your composition, not necessarily golden or otherwise, but just triangles. In an attempt to do things a little quicker, keep the photos in Bridge and not bring them into Photoshop, I'm just going to use these brushes to trigger the highlight clip warning so that it kind of looks like a red brush and you can see the triangles here that I want to point out. Now, I'm starting with more obvious ones. Okay, this whole folder are some obvious examples of triangles. Let's go through a bunch right here, looking out for high contrast, deep shadows, very directional light situations will of course help towards getting you some interesting geometric shapes in your compositions. Mountain tops create a very natural triangle, of course. And any scene with really nice leading lines creating a perspective feel in its depth will naturally create triangles. We're technically seeing 4 different triangles here, also leading lines. Here again, We have some really nice perspective both from the ground and from the buildings, and this is giving us some beautiful triangles. You'll start to notice that, at least in these examples, we're getting a lot of overlap here, right? Didn't I already teach a chapter on leading lines? And this is a very clear leading line coming in from the bottom left, and we have somewhat of a leading line coming in here from the bottom right, etc., etc. Well, yeah, there is overlap, and that's intentional. I think when you start to follow these guidelines and keep these things in mind, your composition will fall into place in tandem with each other. If you have beautiful leading lines, chances are you'll probably be creating a triangle. Looking out for triangles, you'll probably be introducing some cool directional light or some leading lines in your composition. So let's move ahead and look at some more examples here. Looking up at some big buildings in a city scene is a really nice way to give you these natural triangles. And if you start looking closely and start analyzing further, you're actually seeing a whole bunch of triangles here in this image. Okay, some more examples here. Again, using perspective. Maybe this one in a little bit less obvious way, but we are seeing this triangle effect. And here we're getting some really interesting triangles. Again, using this high contrast sun shade situation, which I think gives a very cool effect. Okay, let's move into some little bit less obvious photos, and then we're gonna go into even less obvious photos. So pay attention, the triangles are gonna get a little bit more difficult to see. But here we have a very cleverly placed subject in the middle of these letters that yields this very interesting triangle. And here we have a group setting that if we were to, I'm not going to make a triangle here, but if we were to just encapsulate what the eye is seeing, it is not a circle, right? It's not a square. There is an argument to be made that this is composed, inspired by a more triangular composition. Okay, here we have what's going to be our first of many human portrait examples. In general, your arms will naturally create a triangle. Okay, here's another one that you may find familiar. And again, this is creating a nice triangle shape, or we could say that the whole subject here is a triangle. If you're starting to get annoyed that I'm just painting triangles on random photos, listen. I, first of all, did not make up this guideline. It is, I think, an important compositional technique, and I did not pull these photos out at random. These are inspired on some level by this triangular composition. And if you do look at it, we're not seeing a square. We're not seeing a circle, right? There is clearly, especially with the arms, a very clear indication of some triangular form in this photo. Some are more obvious, some are not. But I promise you, I'm not pulling your leg, okay? Here we have a little bit of a less obvious example, but if you see, if we kind of cut this frame from where the sun is hitting, that is creating a nice triangle. And if we kind of cut it again where the shade is, that's going to create another triangle. Let me get rid of the lines so maybe you can see it with your eye. A little bit more subtle, but there's clearly triangles helping this composition out. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a batch that's even less obvious, and I'm going to use my red brush tool here to show you, but it's so clever when you really start to analyze this. By placing this subject's knees in this position, the body posture is really helping out this chair, which also is a triangle. And we have a few triangles going on here. Now we can also start to analyze maybe the light pattern here, maybe this wall to the couch creating a triangle. I think that's a little bit less obvious. I think more to the point is this framing right here in the center, which I think is very cool. Like I said, we'll see this coming up, and I think this is probably the most important thing to keep in mind when you're doing your own shooting, and that's arms, the human arm. Notice how this subject is cutting the frame in half with the arm, and this is creating a nice natural triangle. And again, there's something that can be said about these other triangles happening here. We've got a triangle here. We've got a triangle here. Now that this is super messy, let me see if I can remove all of these lines, and just with your eye, see if you can analyze this scene and start to see these triangles for yourself. Let me just pause for a moment, because perhaps I didn't stress this enough, but it's not just triangles are good, or I'm telling you, you want triangles in your frame. Triangles, geometric shapes in general, but more specifically triangles, like a leading line, also in line often with a leading line, helps to break up the rectangular shape that is a photograph, and helps to guide and lead the viewer's eyes throughout the frame to different elements. So that really is the point of a triangle. It's not just it's good, it's guiding lines that make a composition interesting and unique to look at. Okay, so let's move on to another example here. This is also a very cool example of the subject kind of cutting diagonally across the frame. And maybe that's a good way for you guys to think about it when you're shooting for yourself. Like, forget looking for triangles, but if you're going to have a subject, try placing them diagonally across the frame. If you have a subject with arms, try and guide them so that they're a leading line that's intersecting the frame diagonally, and that's automatically going to create a triangle, because that's how shapes work. So here we see a very interesting shape from the placement of this person who's drowning. What the heck is going on there? Okay, let's just keep going. Here we have a lovely line, and this is very intentionally done, where we have continuity across the whole body, which again is something to keep in mind, perhaps not thinking in terms of triangles, but thinking in terms of continuity and creating any line, even if this were horizontal, with posing of subjects in your frame. That in general will give you a more pleasing result. Okay, here we have two arms coming out of the frame that's creating a really nice triangle here. Again, holding an arm out, that's instantly shaping our subject. And another for good measure, arm on the head or the face is gonna give you instantly a really nice triangular look. And more importantly is that this is mirroring this line of the stairs here and of the stairs here. And if you look back here, so it's not just creating a triangle on the subject here, but it's important that the shape and the lines are paralleling other objects in the scene, which will create a real nice continuity and will generally be more pleasing to the viewer. You can even see some triangles peeking their head out over here, back there. You can really go on forever. So here I just wanted to bring up a couple of photographs from a professional photographer by the name of Steven Meisel. I'm not going to paint on this one, but you can clearly see triangular formations that the photographer intentionally set. Here we have a little bit less obvious, but we are seeing lines that are affected by placement of the subjects here. And finally, perhaps more obvious as he's using actual triangles in the set. But I wanted to point out how he's mirroring the triangle with the shape of the body formation. So by telling this subject, okay, put your left arm out like this, have your right leg locked. Same for this woman in the purple here. So you're mirroring the triangles that already exist in the scene. That's what really makes these triangles jump off the page here. Okay, here we have a less obvious ray of light. Here we have a very interesting photograph, and your eye is very much drawn to some very particular lines in this frame. The first one, I believe, let me make this a little bit thicker. The first one, I believe, is this brightest part of the image given by the railing here. And then we have the umbrella creating a really nice line that draws your eye past that. This is I think, a really good non-obvious example of where these triangles tend to creep into really good composition. Likewise here, before I paint anything, I want you guys to just look and analyze. You can see the light is shaped in a certain way here, where we have shadow here across the back of his body here, and then this light, this lamp, you can very clearly see the outline of it that's creating this really interesting triangular flow of light that is revealing what the photographer wants to reveal, while everything else is essentially in shadow, which is a very cool technique. Here too, arms from the corners creating a diagonal line that's going to give you triangles. And this, I think you can see pretty clearly, makes for a more interesting subject, makes for a more interesting composition, rather than if they were just holding hands in the center and the arm was coming out here. Cutting the frame in this diagonal way will bring more interest to the image, and I think will bring the viewer's eye into the frame better. Okay, just a couple more examples. So here we see again, positioning the subject on a diagonal line, cutting the frame right down the middle creates some really nice interest in the form of triangle. And then we also have some smaller triangles here that help this effect even more. Here we have a bunch of triangles that's created from the banister here. And then we could even go further and call out the triangles up here as well. But again, it's these lines that break up the composition and the straightness, if you will, of the rectangular form of our photographic frame that we're working with. And it really helps to guide the viewer into a particular scene. And finally, last but not least, we have a very interesting usage of lens flare. By positioning the camera right into the sun, we're getting these really nice optical flares here that's actually creating a line that's now framing our subject. Call it a leading line, call it a rule of third, call it, maybe it's in the golden spiral. Well, that's a great drawing. And just before we sign off here, I wanted to very briefly touch on geometric shapes that aren't triangles. I'm not going to go into this in detail here, but in general, geometric shapes will provide interest in your frame. Look out for interesting patterns created by lights and shadows, or natural lines, or objects placed in a scene, as these geometric shapes will give you more interest in your shots. All right, thanks so much. That was a chapter from the 101 course all about triangles and geometric shapes, and now you're gonna see them everywhere. If you are interested in learning more about this entire course, Shooting 101 Photography Fundamentals, that goes into more than 5 hours of composition fundamentals, shooting in manual mode, and an intro to understanding lighting fundamentals, you can visit 52frames.com/course. That'll be it for this week. Until next time, happy shooting.